The Intimations of a Post-Capitalist Society in Marx's Critique of Political Economy by Peter Hudis. 1. Where to begin anew in developing an alternative to capitalism. 200 years after Karl Marx's birth, there is no problem more urgent to address and difficult to resolve than developing an emancipatory alternative to capitalism that can serve as a pole of attraction for masses of people. The need for this is becoming increasingly clear. Capitalism's insatiable drive to commodify the life world is subjecting an array of human activities to monetary transactions while producing a level of environmental destruction that threatens the very basis of civilization. We have clearly reached the point, even putting the risk of imperialist wars aside, at which the question before us is whether humanity has a future if an alternative to capitalism fails to arise. However, while growing numbers of people around the world today aspire for such an alternative, developing one is proving very difficult. There are at least two reasons for this. One is the very nature of capitalism, in which human relations take on the form of relations between things. Diverse products of labor can enter into quantitative relations with one another only if they share a common quality. That common quality is their value. However, as Marx noted, quote, "Value does not have its description branded on its forehead, it rather transforms every product of labor into a social hieroglyphic," end quote. Since value can only show itself in a relation between physical material entities, it appears that what enables products to be exchanged is the natural property of the things themselves instead of a historically specific form of social labor. Capitalism is defined by a curious anomaly. Capitalism is a system that produces unprecedented levels of change and transformation at the same time as appearing to be an immutable fact of life. Capitalism must appear to the common imagination in this way, precisely because capitalism is based on augmenting wealth computed in monetary terms as an end in itself. The second reason that it has proven difficult to develop a viable alternative is the profound crises and ultimate failures of the numerous efforts to create, quote, socialist or, quote, communist regimes over the course of the last 100 years. Social democratic governments, both in the West and in parts of the developing world, have at times managed to promote valuable social reforms, but they ultimately failed to project an alternative to capitalism. Instead, they ended up capitulating to neoliberalism, which has itself provided an opening for resurgent xenophobic racism and narrow nationalism. The Marxist-Leninist regimes that came to power in much of the developing world succeeded by and large in asserting national sovereignty against imperialism, but those regimes proved no less of a failure. Their substitution of, quote, market anarchy, end quote, by statist command economies led to gross inefficiencies as well as some of the most repressive regimes on the planet. None succeeded in making a firm break with capitalism, as shown by the fact that virtually all of them ended up openly embracing actually existing capitalism. So where do we begin developing an alternative? It cannot be devised by theoreticians irrespective of the actual struggles against existing society by workers, peasants, women, racial and national minorities, and LGBTQ people. Masses of people, especially at critical turning points such as we face today, create forms of struggle and organization that seek to reverse the deleterious impact of capitalist social relations upon everyday life. These need to be listened to and built upon in developing an alternative, especially because so many of them express the need for non-hierarchical social relations that go beyond the horizons of both capitalism and statist, quote, socialism. Yet at the same time, today's nascent efforts to promote an alternative need a theory that can pinpoint the specific social relations that must be transformed in order to surmount the capitalist law of value. But what can serve as the source of such a theory if the approach of many socialists and communists failed to live up to the task? We cannot live by the truths of a different era, but neither can we turn our backs on history by ignoring important sources within the socialist and communist traditions that speak to our present-day concerns. There is, of course, no more important source of socialist and communist thought than the work of Marx. While Marx is widely credited or condemned for his exhaustive critique of the capitalist mode of production, it is often presumed that Marx had little or nothing to say about a post-capitalist society. So how could his critique of political economy, which has as its aim, as he famously stated, analyses of the law of motion of capitalism, have anything to tell us today about an alternative to capitalism? The answer, first of all, lies in the fact that Marx's work does not consist of a radical political economy. Marx's work instead represents a critique of the very foundations of political economy. Economics deals with existing formations while taking for granted the conditions that establish the possibility for those formations' existence. The classical political economist, and even more so the neoclassical economist that succeeded the classical political economists, viewed capitalism as a necessary expression and fulfillment of human nature. The classical political economists therefore felt no need to highlight the transitory and historical nature of capitalism. The classical political economists defined the future in terms of the temporal horizon of the present. Marx's theoretical project proceeds from a completely opposite standpoint. Marx's greatest theoretical work, Capital, does not consist of a theory of capitalist development. Capital instead delineates capitalism's tendency towards crisis and dissolution. Marx could do so because Marx analyzed capitalism from the conceptual standpoint of socialism. Marx grasped the reality of the present through the temporal horizon of the future. One of the few Marxists to understand this was Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg wrote, quote, "The secret of Marx's theory of value, of Marx's analysis of money, Marx's theory of capital, Marx's theory of the rate of profit, and consequently the whole existing economic system is, end bracket, the final goal, socialism." And precisely because, a priori, Marx looked at capitalism from the socialist point of view, that is, from the historical point of view, Marx was enabled to decipher the hieroglyphics of a capitalist economy, end quote. Rosa Luxemburg, Social Reform or Revolution. In the Rosa Luxemburg Reader, edited by Peter Hudis and Kevin B. Anderson. End footnote. No one doubts that Marx criticized the utopian socialists for idle speculation about the future, just as it is widely known that he eschewed writing blueprints about the new society. But that does not mean Marx lacked an understanding of what is required for a socialist society to come into existence. Marx's entire career consisted of a series of extended polemics against other radical thinkers from Proudhon to Lassalle, who, in his view, had a defective understanding of the nature of socialism or communism. It was on the basis of a distinctive understanding of the, quote, final goal, end quote, that Marx proceeded to analyze and delineate capitalism's tendency towards crisis and dissolution. Closer to our age, the Czech Marxist humanist philosopher Karel Kosik argued again along similar lines concerning the radical divide between Marx's project and traditional economics in Dialectics of the Concrete. Quote, "Economics is the objective world of people and of their social products. Economics is not the objectual world of the social movement of things. The social movement of things, which masks social relations of people and people's products, is one particular historically transient form of economics, ... This is where Marx's theory is a critique of economics in the proper sense of the word. It exhibits the real movement of economic categories as a reified form of the social movement of people. This critique discovered that the categories of the social movement of things are necessary and historically transient existential forms of the social movement of people." End quote. Karel Kosik, Dialectics of the Concrete, a study on problems of man and the world. End footnote. I guess I should have said the footnote first, but yeah. That quote wasn't a footnote, that was in the text. In sum, capital is not an empirical critique of actually existing capitalist societies. Capital is a dialectical critique of what is integral to capitalist societies, the logic of capital grounded in the law of value. Dialectical analysis as existing empiricist approaches, as against existing, dialectical analysis as against empiricist approaches does not merely describe the nature of an existing thing, but explores the existing thing's process of transition into what that existing thing is not. As much as Marx tried to avoid speculating about the future, as a deeply dialectical thinker, Marx could not help but intimate its future transcendence. The transcendence that he had in mind, now that we have the full corpus of his work available for study, turns out to be quite different from how most post-Marx Marxists conceived of the new society. It is this dimension of Marx's work, above all else, that speaks to the realities facing us today. I will seek to demonstrate this by re-examining the intimations of a new society found in Marx's critique of political economy. Footnote. For a fuller discussion of these issues, see Peter Hudis, Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism. End footnote. The humanist content of Marx's value theory of labor. Capital cannot be understood if capital's central categories are viewed as eternal quasi-natural factors that apply to all forms of society. Money, private property, and the market do not mean the same thing in capitalism as in pre-capitalist societies. Most importantly, Marx held that production for the sake of increasing value or wealth in monetary terms is unique to capitalism and capitalism alone. Production for the sake of increasing value or wealth in monetary terms does not exist before capitalism or after capitalism. Value is not the same as material wealth, which does exist in all societies. This distinction is the pivot upon which the entirety of Marx's critique of capital turns. Value not being the same as material wealth. The distinguishing mark of capitalism is that labor assumes a value form. Value or wealth measured in monetary terms is the expression of a special form of social labor. Hence, labor, quote, as such, end quote, is not the source of value. According to Marx, only a particular kind of labor is the source of value. A commodity's value is determined not by the actual amount of time taken to produce a commodity, but by the socially necessary labor time established on a global level. If value were determined by actual labor time, workers would be made to work as slowly as possible, since the greater the labor time, the greater is the amount of accumulated value. That never happens, of course, because the value of commodities is determined not by actual labor time, but by socially necessary labor time over which workers have no control. This average varies continuously, but to technological innovations that increase the productivity of labor. Due to technological innovations that increase the productivity of labor. It is communicated to the agents of production behind their backs through the laws of competition. As capitalism progresses, concrete labor, the varied kinds of labor employed in making use values, becomes increasingly dominated by labor that conforms to an abstract average termed by Marx as, quote, abstract labor, end quote. Abstract labor, and abstract labor alone, is the substance of value, which takes the phenomenal form of exchange value in the market. The exchange value, or value represented in the body of something, be that another commodity or money, is the necessary, this is me talking, is the necessary form of appearance of value. Michael Heinrich uses the verb caught at one point, I believe, in one of his talks that I heard, is like value has to be caught in things. Value is a rather abstract category, which makes it all the easier to overlook the fact that value expresses a peculiar kind of human activity, labor that is constrained by a time determination that is outside the worker's control. Once labor assumes a dual form in which abstract labor dominates concrete labor, productive activity ceases to be the expression of the worker's creativity, but instead becomes a monotonous thing-like form that suppresses it. This reification of the worker's concrete sensuous activity in the drive to generate greater wealth in abstract monetary form is the essence of capitalism. Hence, Marx's theory of value marks a radical break from classical political economists like Ricardo. The assumption among many followers as well as critics of Marx is that both have the same labor theory of value, but draw different conclusions from that same labor theory of value, since Marx singles out the existence of surplus value, the difference between the value of labor and the value of the product, whereas Ricardo does not. In other words, it is assumed that both Marx and Ricardo have a quantitative theory of value, that is, so many hours of labor determine the value of the product. It logically follows from this assumption that, quote, Marxism, end quote, is a more radical version of Ricardianism in that Marxism, in quotes, seeks to effect a, quote, fair, end quote, redistribution of value by providing workers with a greater share of the surplus product. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Unlike Ricardo, Marx does not have a quantitative labor theory of value. Marx does not hold that actual labor time or concrete labor is the source of value. Concrete labor is only the source of use values. Marx emphasizes again and again that the substance of value is abstract labor, a qualitative determination that Ricardo, like all classical political economists, simply ignored. Ironically, most established Marxists have also ignored it, as seen in their failure to grasp that value production applies only to capitalism, precisely because value production is a product of the peculiar form of social labor that is specific to capitalism, abstract or alienated labor. These distinctions are not a matter of scholastic hair-splitting, since they directly determine the understanding of the alternative to capitalism. All societies devote a certain amount of time to labor. If actual labor time is the source of value, it follows that all societies, including socialist societies, are defined by value production. The social form of labor that is peculiar to capitalism becomes treated as an immutable transhistorical fact of human existence. The whole point and purpose of Capital, the book, to take issue with those who transform, quote, into eternal laws of nature and reason, the social forms springing from the present mode of production, end quote, is turned on its head. Once value production is assumed to be a permanent feature of the human landscape, it follows that, quote, socialism, end quote, is defined as little more than a, quote, fair, end quote, redistribution of value. The real problem, the reduction of human relations to relations between things, is rendered invisible. This standpoint has largely defined both social democratic and Stalinist approaches. The discrepancy between the amount of value produced by workers and the amount workers receive in wages would be solved, they claim, through state management of the economy. Yet this approach ignores the real problem. The fact that labor and other human relations take on a value form. The ultimate expression of value is money. Money is a non-sensuous abstraction, but human beings are sensuous concrete beings. Money is hardly, quote, it is, quote, it is hardly, quote, natural, end quote, to measure a person by how much money a person is, quote, worth, end quote. But it seems completely natural from a capitalist viewpoint, since people count in capitalism. It's important to say it says its eyes. That's probably actually significant, so I probably shouldn't try to replace that. But it seems completely natural from a capitalist viewpoint, since people count in its eyes, capitalism's eyes, not the capitalist eyes, only to the extent that they augment value and profit. Those who focus on the redistribution of value without targeting the existence of value production therefore naturalize and render invisible the very thing that makes capitalism a dehumanizing system. Moreover, attempts to, quote, abolish, end quote, surplus value by redistributing value, fine as that may be for temporarily redressing some of the inequities of capitalism, ultimately prove quixotic, or quixotic? I'm going to see how to pronounce that. I see that word all the time. Don't know how to say it.
Quixotic.
Quixotic, huh? It is how you pronounce it. It's how it's spelled. Ultimately prove quixotic, since attempts to, quote, abolish, end quote, surplus value by redistributing value leave untouched the social relations that give rise to these inequities. Surplus value follows from value production, not the other way around. The value of a commodity is produced by labor power, which is not the same as living labor. This distinction between living labor and labor power is the pivot of Marx's theory of surplus value and profit. Labor power is the only commodity that is capable of producing a greater value than itself. To try to eliminate surplus value and profit while leaving intact the abstract or alienated labor that defines the expenditure of human labor is akin to cutting off the head of a hydra while leaving its body intact. It is only a matter of time before the head grows back, nay, before many more heads grow back. Such has been the fate of status, quote, socialism, end quote, in the 20th century. The categories employed by Marx in Capital anticipate these later developments, since they disclose that the law of value rests upon a specific set of alienated human relations. An exit from capitalism is not possible without uprooting them. There is no other solution. As Marx wrote in 1844, quote, all emancipation is a reduction of the human world and relationships to humanity itself, end quote. This perspective never left Marx. The radical depth of Marx's humanist critique of capital is often unrecognized even by insightful commentators. For example, David Harvey has recently argued that Marx did not really have a labor theory of value. He says many have confused Marx with Ricardo's labor theory of value. He rests this on the claim that the value created in production is illusory so long as it is not realized through market transactions. He writes, quote, I take the value created in production to be only a potential value until that potential value is realized. An alternative way would be to say that the value is produced, but then the value is lost if there is no demand for that value on the market, end quote. But if abstract labor, as Marx insists, is the substance of value, how can the value of which it is the substance be, quote, lost, end quote? Does this not imply that abstract labor's existence also depends on the market? Marx clearly says the opposite, however, in Capital. Quote, the value of a commodity is expressed in its price before it enters into circulation, and it is therefore a precondition of circulation, not its result. End quote. I think a lot of people within the value form theory would take issue to what the Hudis just said in that paragraph. To be sure, realization is a major component of expanded reproduction. However, what is, quote, realized, end quote, in market exchange is not value but capital. The value is already there, quote, before it enters into circulation, end quote. If capital cannot be exchanged for money, then the value embodied in capital is destroyed. The destruction of capital is, of course, integral to capitalism. It especially occurs during recessions and depressions, when less profitable units of capital are allowed to go under in favor of more profitable units of capital. But what drives this process is not the inability to sell the products due to a lack of effective demand on the market, but rather a decline in the rate of profit due to the growth of the organic composition of capital relative to the employment of living labor. On this channel, there's in the I have a. It's one of my first recordings. It's pretty sketchy. I read too fast. Didn't realize how. Didn't realize how. I don't know. I didn't get any complaints about it, but when I listened to him, like, I'm talking way too fast, and it probably made me fuck up a lot. But if you read that book, in the chapters that are pertain to Volume 3, Heinrich provides a critique of this decline in the rate of profit theory. Anyway, back to this. This has crucial ramifications. If the value of a commodity does not truly exist until that value is realized in exchange, it follows that the elimination of value production and the transcendence of capitalism hinges on the management of exchange relations. Organizing the arrangement of things, such as prices and commodities and markets, becomes viewed as the pivot of creating a non-capitalist society. Harvey himself suggests that a revival of Keynesian welfare state policies that more equitably redistribute surplus value is the path that can best promote an exit from capitalism. Aside from the fact that there is little evidence that Keynesian measures, even at their best, ever seriously challenged capitalism, such market-based, quote, solutions, end quote, leave untouched the social form of labor that grounds capitalist social existence. The emphasis on the meaning of things via organizing exchange leaves aside the need to transform human relations. Just a side note from me, the notion that value cannot simply depends on validation on a marketplace does not entail that the person who subscribes to that theory, such as the people who are influenced by Isaac Illich Rubin, this is kind of like Rubin's like main thesis, definitely aren't Keynesians or something like that. There's no necessary connection between Keynesianism and that thesis. But I mean, from my memory, I remember even reading it when I was like, from my memory, Harvey's companion to Marx's Capital was very unsatisfactory when just trying to describe the relations of things like value, exchange value, concrete labor, abstract labor, um, all of the stuff. Um, yeah. Basically, I'm saying that David Harvey is not probably the best. The if you're what's it called, straw man or steel man? What's the word? I don't know. If you're going to critique a position, it might be best to critique the best of that position, which in my opinion would be represented by people such as Heinrich Bellafiore, um, other people influenced by Rubens, such as Christopher J. Arthur. Um, yeah. Here's where it becomes essential not to treat categories like quote money end quote or quote value and quote exchange value as abstract quasi-natural categories without reference to the specific social, that is, human relations of which they are the expression. Money, for instance, does not mean the same thing in pre-capitalist societies defined by the exchange of use values as in capitalism, in which use values are produced for the sake of exchange. In capitalism, money is the universal equivalent, and a universal equivalent becomes possible only insofar as labor assumes a value form. Since abstract labor is the substance of value, quote, value requires above all an independent form by means of which value's identity with itself may be asserted, end quote. The independent form is money. The more abstract labor dominates concrete labor, the more all-pervasive becomes the drive to augment value. And the more this continues, the more value must posit an abstract, quote, self-identity with itself, end quote. This means that the logic of capital compels money to assume a form independent of the concrete material properties that makes its existence possible. The increasingly abstract nature of money makes modern capitalism more unstable and turbulent. Bubbles abound and monetary crises increase in frequency and severity. But here is where it gets tricky. Many critics tend to see such financial crises as the decisive issue, which leads them to argue that greater governmental control and regulation of financial and capital markets can produce an exit from capitalism. However, this overlooks the fact that financial or monetary crises are made possible and necessary by the ever more abstractive character of human social activity. As a result, the need to transform the specific human relations that necessitate that money take the form of an abstract universal is not addressed. We are left with a critique of capitalism that fails to keep its finger on the pulse of human relations. Hence, Grasping Capital, the book's intimation of a post-capitalist society, requires being attentive to Marx's distinctive theory of value. As the U.S. Marxist humanist philosopher Raya Dunayevskaya wrote, quote, Marx's primary theory is a theory of what he first called, quote, alienated labor, end quote, and then, quote, abstract or, quote, value-producing, end quote, labor. He analyzed commodities and showed that the exchange of commodities in general had been exchanged more or less sporadically for centuries before capitalism. Capitalism begins when the capacity to labor bracket becomes a commodity. See, the capacity to labor becomes a commodity. The bracket's just confusing. ... Hence, it is more correct to call the Marxist theory of capital not a labor theory of value, but a value theory of labor. Raya Dunayevskaya, Marxism and Freedom from 1776 until today. Is there any other footnotes we need to read? Okay. In essence, what Marx said to Smith. Oh, this is still her. Oh, okay, this is still a quote. Quote, in essence, what Marx said to Smith and Ricardo was, you thought your task was done with the discovery of labor as the source of value. In reality, your task has just begun. If that theory means anything at all, it means that you must deal with man, the laborer, directly. ... Marx's analysis of labor, and this is what distinguishes Marx from all other socialist and communist of his day and of ours, goes much further than the economic structure of society. His analysis goes to the actual human relations. End quote.